So welcome to our second session of the Community Networks Training of 2020. I'm really excited about this session today. We have Deb Sosha and Jane Coffin, and hopefully Madeline Redfern, who is unfortunately experiencing some connectivity issues, so she may or may not be able to make it. But they are here today to discuss partnerships, and this is a topic that is so important when it comes to community networks. It's essential, and I'm so excited to hear from the experts about their experiences and what they think are best practices, worst practices, and more. So a few reminders is to please keep yourself muted. We record all of the sessions and we'd like to minimize interruptions if possible. And then if you have a question, go ahead and type it in the chat or type the word hand in the chat and we can call on you. When we get to the Q&A part, you can also just call out if there's no one in line to ask a question. And like I said before, we're recording all the sessions, so you can go back and watch this later, send it to your friends, send it to anyone who you think might find this helpful. We're going to issue certificates, so you'll need to attend all sessions to receive one. Please email us if you can't make it to a session, because we are taking note of everyone who's on this Zoom call. But if you watched it back later, just let us know. I'm going to plug into the chat the links to our Indigenous Connectivity Summit this year, so you all can register for it if you have not already. This is our conference every year where we bring everyone together to discuss similar challenges and innovative solutions to broadband problems in Indigenous communities. And we're happy to talk about it more. If you want to hear more about it, just ping me or Katie or Sarah or Mark or Kelly. And one other thing is something that we've run into on the policy and advocacy sessions is that there's a lot of acronyms and there's a lot of language that a lot of people may not understand that sometimes people throw around. If you have any acronyms or specific terms that you don't know what they mean, feel free to just throw it in the chat and say, what does this mean? This is a training at the end of the day. You're here to learn, and there's no such thing as a stupid question. So please ask any and all questions that you have. And I think that's it for housekeeping for now. I'm going to go over a little bit of the agenda that we have laid out for you all today. First, we're going to talk about building partnerships with Deb Sosha. Then we're going to talk about maintaining partnerships with Jane Coffin. If Madeline is able to join, she will discuss best practices with partners, but if not, Deb and Jane have plenty of insights to offer to that, so we will discuss that, and then we'll move on to a community discussion and do a Q&A and a wrap-up. So with that, I'm going to turn it over to Deb and Jane to introduce themselves and get the show on the road.
Shall I start, Jane?
Yes, please, ma'am.
Hi, everyone. Thanks for being here. And Chris Mitchell, I love your photo. That's perfect. I'm going to do that for my staff meeting tomorrow. So I work at the Enterprise Center here in Chattanooga, Tennessee, and we have 3 areas of focus. One is Smart Community Initiative, and that's a partnership between the university, healthcare, energy, transportation, about 25 different organizations. The other thing we do is work on innovation district programming. And so again, that's partnering with probably 40 or 50 different organizations. And the third thing we work on is digital equity work. And we run a program called Tech Goes Home. And we provide technology training and low-cost internet access to low-income families, seniors, children across the board. And again, we work with 200 partners on that work. So I pretty much, my whole role in Chattanooga is working on partnerships. So this is a good time for me to be talking to you about this. One of our goals is always to connect people to people, connect people to resources, and to problem solve to ensure that collaboration can take place. So we end up being the glue and the duct tape that runs back and forth and solves all these problems so that we can make the big thing work. So previous to this role, I actually worked at Next Century Cities, and they help cities, towns, and counties find ways to get fast, affordable, reliable broadband. I actually worked with both Anna and Katie there during my time there. So it's really been great to be able to be back here and talk some more. So I'm going to talk a little bit about how do you build those partnerships and build successful opportunities for groups that don't typically always work well together to work well together. So the first thing that I know from my experience from Tech Goes Home is that if you're going to build a partnership, you have to be trusted. And I know you all that know me have heard this before, but progress only happens at the speed of trust. So who owns the trust in the community where you live or work? And that's how you begin your partnerships, is you work with the people that are already trusted. Here in Chattanooga, that is faith-based folks, local community anchor institutions, teachers, librarians, informal leaders within the community. And so then how do you engage those folks? I think the important thing is to not walk in with a solution, but to walk in with a question, right? What is it that your community needs, and how can I work with you to bring that about? I think far too often people come in with a solution as opposed to coming in with a question. So I think that's important. And then talking about what can we do together that will make families be more successful. And in this case, right now, we're working on a very large project here to connect all of our families to high-speed internet, regardless of capacity to pay. So basically, we will connect 28,500 children to 100 megabits symmetrical, and it will not cost them anything for 10 years, right? So you can imagine the complexity of all the people. We've got a huge school system. We've got elected officials who are a whole unique brand all by themselves, and we have the local utility. And I mean, it's just a huge process. But I think one of the things that we have discovered is that you have to figure out how to make it a win for everybody, right? What is the win for the school system? Well, all their children can learn from home during this pandemic. What is the win for EPB, our electric power board, which is our utility? Well, we're placing optical network terminals, those things they put on the outside of the houses for the internet. We're purchasing those with philanthropic dollars, and they have, the goodwill of the community. And so, figuring out what all the wins are is an important thing. In terms of broadband access, one of the things that I have learned is how important this is to the tribal communities I've spoke to in terms of learning their community's language, and that there is a way to make that language more accessible over time. And it's important to be able to share those stories and to stay connected to their families. The other way we've been able to get a trusted relationship is by proxy, which is kind of an unusual way to think about it. But if a trusted entity in the community trusts me, then the folks in that community might allow me to participate in whatever the effort is, because they trust this person to have their best interest. And if this person says, hey, Deb's okay, then I get a little bit more entrance there. And in a lot of cases here in Chattanooga, that's a faith-based leader, or it's a teacher, a librarian. That kind of connection works for us. The next way that we have developed trust is through our actions and outcomes. So if we say we're going to do something and then it doesn't happen, we have damaged that relationship. And it's much, much harder to go back and fix a broken relationship than it is to start with no relationship. So I always make sure what I say I'm going to do, I do, and that if at all possible, faster than I said I was going to do it, right? So always trying to think about how to ensure that people feel comfortable that you not only care about them, but that you mean what you say. And then the other thing I would say in terms of trust in a community is having a local community member who owns that huge amount of trust within the community, being an advocate for the effort that you are bringing forward. So when I think about that, and I think about certain towns, cities across the country that have worked, for example, to get community broadband, there's always been a champion. So whatever it is you're trying to figure out, find that champion in the community and work with that person to get the message out. The next thing I wanted to talk about is how do you create a shared purpose? Because if we are going to do this work together and we're in this work together, how do we make sure we all have the same vision for what that looks like? And I'll tell you, we struggled a bit with this here in Chattanooga, and we're fixing this, but because we had to move so fast in raising the funds for the work that we're doing, we didn't talk to each other quite enough, and we've got some things we need to fix. But being careful about that and planful about that whenever you can be, I think helps to smooth the way forward. So I think the most important thing I can do is listen, right? It's way more important than saying anything. I need to listen to my partners. I need to listen to the community. I need to listen carefully for what is not being said and not just what is being said. And I need to invite questions and be welcoming of questions. In these kinds of circumstances, it's important to be part of that team and to allow natural leadership to emerge and to work alongside those folks because we're agreeing on a common mission. And when we were at Next Century Cities, I think Katie actually wrote this piece, but it was a whole sample playbook on how to build partnerships. And one of the whole chapters was about work with and not for, right? I shouldn't walk in with a decision. I shouldn't walk in with a plan. I should walk in with what do you need and how can I be a part of the solution? Now, how do you keep the vision at the forefront of the work? And that's a part of it that's really important to me. And that is, we need to put it in writing, right? Let's put it in writing together, what we think this is, because what we in a meeting may hash out may feel different in my brain than yours. So let's put it in writing and let's remind each other regularly what that vision is. Some of the teams I work with actually read that vision at the beginning of every meeting we have, just to keep us all on focus. The other thing I'd say is, I don't take money if it moves me from my mission. And that's really hard to say no thank you, but I won't take money if it dilutes the mission of what we're trying to accomplish. It's a hard thing to do as a nonprofit because if you know much about nonprofits, we are hand to mouth, right? This is, you are lucky if you've got 6 months of leeway, but we are really cautious at the Enterprise Center to only take funds that help us meet our mission. I think the other piece about engaging the community is understanding the norms of that community and asking and learning and being a part of the solution, knowing that you're going to need multiple languages, knowing that video won't always work. Understanding that a lot of the work that we're doing as we are creating things, we're measuring the literacy level. If the literacy level is a senior in high school, we're missing people when we send that out, right? The average adult reading level is 7th grade. So we should be careful about that, right? So how do we make sure that we are respectful of the people who are brilliant, but maybe aren't the most comfortable with the written word? So how else can we communicate information? So on Tech Goes Home, the project that we run, we know that we have a problem with cost, availability of access, right? Devices and digital skills training. And so we run a program that trains the trainer. And so here's how we manage it. So we work with a group of pastors here in Chattanooga. They collectively call themselves Kingdom Partners. We are training members of their church to run our program in their church. So we have built that trust with the pastor. We have trained somebody from their church. The person doing the training is somebody that everybody in the community knows and trusts. And after the course is done, it's 15 hours of training, they know who to go to. So maybe I don't remember how to manage this or that, but I know who knows, and I can go to this person from my church and get that information. So having it right in the neighborhood where I live, provided by somebody I know, changes the outcomes for that program. I think just a couple more things I'll mention is that giving whoever the elected or natural leaders in a community the opportunity to take all the credit is often a really smart move, right? I am so happy not to be the one that that says anything or gets in front of people. I am happy to let the elected officials or the head of the whatever programs we're running be the folks who get that attention. My goal is solely to provide that service. And so I am happy to let other folks take the credit. And I think there's a quote out there that says, it's amazing how much you can accomplish when you don't care about getting the credit. And I think that's very true. So I'm going to turn it over now to Jane. Well,
thank you, Deb. And welcome everyone, and thank you very much. I'll do a quick intro, and just to also say that everything Deb said, I couldn't just support more. It's something we've learned here at the Internet Society. But for those that don't know me, I work at the Internet Society. I'm a Senior Vice President for Internet Growth. What that means is I work with wonderful people and try and amplify them, as Deb was saying, and they get the credit for all the great work on community networks, something called Internet Exchange Points, which is basically some core infrastructure that may not exist in many places. I've spent time in government, working overseas in very different cultures, building regulators, policymakers, and infrastructure. And also working back in the government again, a second round at NTIA, always international, and then coming back through ISOC, the Internet Society, to do more work both globally, building partnerships and communities of interest to support infrastructure, but also more local work, thanks to Mark and Katie and Anna and Sarah and the team here, and Kelly and all of you, and just really seeing the importance. I'm from Maine, which is a small state up in the northeastern part of the United States. I grew up with pretty sketchy connectivity, and I still have to jump up and down at the end of my parents' driveway to get a signal. So I know what it's like to be in places, and this was part of my overseas experience too, in Moldova and Armenia, places I didn't necessarily know what to do, and I learned the hard way about how to build relationships rather than tear them down in 2 seconds. But these were places that had very little connectivity, and so I've worked in places where you're just waiting for the ISP to get rebooted for 3 days, 4 days, a week. So know that I'm trying to come at what I'm saying here today, both from a culturally respectful perspective, and Deb and I are going to open this up to everyone to help us with some of the best practices as well, because we know that many of you have such great experience doing what you do, but also everyone can contribute. I think that's something that is important about how we also operate at the Internet Society with our partners. And Deb said it well, it's a with, not a for. We have a saying that came from a colleague in the Asia Pacific. It's with the community, by the community, for the community. So with those partnerships that you're building and that we've built, it's really important. You can build up a partnership over years, and it can disappear in 5 minutes if you're not careful about how to respect and honor the community you're working with and the community champions. I think I was writing down words while Deb was speaking about honoring your partners, working on the trust, and humbleness. I think, Deb, that's something you embody, which is you don't want to be the one out there, because we're trying to help support where we can. Part of the maintaining the relationship is not going where we're not asked to go, but going to places where people are interested in what we can do to amplify them as a community to build. One of the critical things that I've learned over time is that you do not want to be the single point of failure as a partner. You are totally trying to build this broad pyramid base of partnerships and people on the ground so that you're creating, I often will tweet, the human nets build the net nets. So it's that human network and infrastructure that you're building as a mesh of people to build the networks. I think that anybody that tells me that internet connectivity or basic wireless Wi-Fi it's all about the technology, I just shake my head. Like as Deb was saying, if you've got to find your trusted people, but you've got to work with them and continue to empower them to build the infrastructure. But through that empowerment, it's really making them the focus, but making sure that they're building other relationships, that network of people, because that's what you're going to rely on for sustainability in the long run. And that's where, any of our organizations and all of you come together and bring different pieces of expertise, but you'll start to build out that bigger mesh. So if there's any takeaway there, it's that pyramid base has to be really strong. And find those people that will amplify the message as well. And again, we don't want to ever speak. We try not to speak for people. And it's been very critical when working with different cultures around the world, and particularly with the communities that many of you are from, is respect and honor and figuring out, you know, how we continue that relationship. You take it to the next level. We used to talk about it as the startup part of the relationship, the intermediate part, the more advanced part. And that's the transition to the community, working with the community, figuring out what the community needs and how to build a bigger network. And then take the community that we're working with, and they're the trainers, they're the messengers, they're taking out that message and they're building more and more. So it becomes this, it's sort of the exponential growth, like the internet has grown. It's the communities that grow. I will say that recently, when we've been working on the tribal priority window with partners, they did all the work. We just saw what we could do with Mark, Katie, others, to just, and Jeff and Matt, how we could come in to just support, and then figure out how we're not that failure of support. Again, it's not speaking for, but with, at the pace of the community. I think some people get frustrated when they go into certain communities and they don't realize culturally what the pace is, how the community works. So maintaining that relationship depends on also being very careful to listen, as Deb said, listen hard and listen for what's not there, and try very hard to make sure that you don't also have one champion, you have to have many. You've got to figure out how to build more and more. That can be difficult in some places where you may not have all of that training. And so that's why we're doing this type of training now. We'll have more training during the ICS. And broaden out your base. You're going to be working with people that you never thought you'd work with. You're going to find that over time, when you've built all the partnerships, you've got to work with government. You're finding different municipal authorities, tribal authorities, and others that in other tribes or other communities that you hadn't worked with before. So it's often trying to figure out what your least common denominator is across different communities and cultures, to try and figure out how to make something work for a different, greater benefit, not just for your community, but for a broader community of interest. I think that's sometimes what we often can come in and do, and show different case studies that we've for other projects we've worked on, where it's more of a, does this work? Adopt it if you like, adapt it is the most important thing. I've often seen people come in from the outside, and I felt this when I was working in Armenia. I literally said to my colleagues, when are they gonna leave? There were some consultants who had come in, they weren't listening. They thought, my God, they knew everything. And I looked at that and I thought, how could you possibly go to a place and think this is, that you know better? So call us on it ever if we're not doing that. But again, with the maintenance, it is working very hard with each other, with the different cultures that you may not have been working with before, broadening that interest and identifying for other parties like us, Deb, other municipal authorities, what you do need. Change is not going to happen if we don't push harder on this. And right now, we have such an amazing opportunity to broaden out the partnership base and to create bigger partnerships, because we need connectivity. There's been no, I mean, of course we always need it, but right now I've said during this crazy period with COVID, it's showing us what we didn't do and holding us accountable, but providing us a great opportunity to go out and really change things. So this is sort of a really kind of weird but exciting time to build out partnerships with people and hold them accountable. This is what the tribal priority window was about. This is what other things we've seen with some regulators now, and policymakers. And to share the data, that's part of the trust building that Deb was talking about, is really share as much information as widely as possible, however you can do that best. And sometimes it's not, quote, via the internet right now. It could be through text or WhatsApp groups or however. But do honor the communities that you've built up by constantly staying in touch. I've seen that with all of the teams around the world. And sometimes it's just a quick tweet that says, you know, amazing work, great job. You know, how hard is it to do that? And I think some people forget that it's those small things that build that trust broader and wider and will form that base of the pyramid that you're looking for. I'm going to stop, Deb, because I think it might be interesting for us to open. Is Madeline on the call? No, okay.
I don't think she's made it, no.
Okay, what we could do is just open up for others that have some, obviously many of you have been building communities for a long time, and ask you to share some of your best practices across the communities that you've worked with, whether it's community networks or another type of, if it's community radio. We'd be very interested because there are other people on the call who've not done this before and haven't been part of that partnership building. So is there anyone that would like to contribute? Because there's so much knowledge here that I think it would be very interesting to share that with some of you. I might start picking on people too. Chris, I see, Chris, that you're in the chat here about working with Deb. Can you give us some of your best practices? Because I know that through what you're doing, and I often will try and retweet you because I find what you're saying is so compelling with respect to community building.
I think I would really reinforce what you'd said regarding where people are really involved and enthusiastic. Our practice has long been that we don't try to get something going. We look for where people have something going and we can help nudge them along. I think that we definitely try to focus on identifying a couple of barriers that we can help people get past, and then trying to do that and letting them lead the way. And I feel like attending the Indigenous Connectivity Summit, the build particularly in Waimanalo last year, really reinforced that, seeing just how capable people are. You know, people that have no technical background can pick this stuff up. It's not that hard. It takes a little bit of work. But, you know, just because we've been doing it for a long time, I think sometimes we forget that this is something that can be learned by people who are motivated to do so. And so I feel like really seeing ourselves as someone that we're capable of solving a few problems and to help people to then solve their own problems is probably a good framework to try to keep in mind.
Yeah, and a lot of empathy, right?
Yeah, well, I mean, this comes to a larger issue, I think, to some extent, of like, there's people think a lot about intelligence, and like, we're all intelligent about some things and unintelligent about other things, and I think it's important to keep that in mind and focus on the things that we know more about and being more humble in the other things. So really, when you're working with people on the ground, respecting that there's a lot of things they can do and that they know that you don't, you know, as being for someone who's not from there.
Yeah, I was humbled with some partners in Colombia and Mexico from indigenous communities who people were picking up some of the basics and or, you know, contributing in other ways with respect to teaching kids about digital skills. So I think a lot of us look at this as an ecosystem. Everyone has something to contribute. Wayne, you had a point in the chat, and Deb, help me also call out some of these great folks who are here. But Wayne, you said the constant communication and follow-up. I think that goes to a point of making sure you're honoring what you said you would do as well.
So if I can jump in just for a second, I see that Kyle has a raised hand. Would Kyle like to speak up? Unmute yourself, maybe. You're muted.
It's that lower left-hand corner.
I'm figuring that out. One of the things I was going to say to Chris about that is what I have said to folks all along at Next Century Cities and here in Chattanooga is I don't know everything, but I probably know somebody who does, right? So if somebody's asking me about certain issues that I am on, I send them to Chris, right? I send them to Jane. So you know, just having that network means the base of your capacity to solve problems has grown exponentially because you know somebody who knows. You don't have to know it all. You just got to know somebody who knows. Kyle, did you get that fixed?
Not yet.
Still seems
muted for a second. I wonder if
I can unmute him.
There's a thing I'm going to amplify. Well, oh, there you go. Great, Kyle.
Kyle, if you just want to type it in the chat, or if you figure out your mute situation, feel free to hop in.
I want to hit on something that Deb also said about looking at different partners that you just never thought you might work with we've been working very closely, and Kelly's been amazing here as well with the library community. And I know there's some tribal libraries out there that they can be your anchor institutions. That's sort of broadening your base of the pyramid and creating more, maintaining those relationships through others as well, where you may not have thought that the school or the library or the hospital. And I'll be very frank, when I was in Armenia, I said, I don't care if it's a local bar, it's not for me to pick, right? But it was sort of like, you pick what your broad community base is and where people go, and where they're going to also just relax and talk to each other about the local solution, because sometimes that solution is really not what you thought it would be as an outsider, and you shouldn't try and drive it. You should let it organically grow, so that partnership is building stronger and stronger. And again, that your partners are stepping forward.
I've been working on issues related to broadband access for about 25 years. It feels like forever. And it's really tempting to say to everybody today with the pandemic, how it has impacted all our families. I told you so. So I won't do that because it won't help us get forward, but I sure think it. What instead I do is try to capture all that energy and move forward any process, any program that will help us get to that end result. But it does feel like I have been practicing for this moment for the past 25 years. And it felt like it was long coming. But it's nice that people are finally at a place where they can recognize the impact of lack of access. I feel like we haven't had that kind of energy behind this work before.
Yeah, it's kind of a crazy opportunity. And Kyle put something really important in the chat there. And I wonder, Dara, have you had the same experience as Kyle, who was indicating that with tribal elders, there's going to always be a different pace of how things work and prioritization from the community side, and the importance of working through that?
Yeah, definitely. And I mean, that's essentially what the basis of sovereignty is, right? Is that it's not one size fits all, even within Indigenous communities. Here in America, we have 574 different federally recognized tribes. And then on top of that, we have state recognized tribes. And then we have tribes who have not become federally recognized, but they are still tribes that have been here since time immemorial. So every one of those is a separate sovereign government, and they're all going to have their own sets of challenges to work through. And I think we see it a lot where people come in from outside of Indigenous communities, and like you were describing with those consultants who came in with all of the answers and just thought that they knew everything, they're going to get shut down really quickly in some of these Indigenous communities. And those leaders are going to enjoy it because they've seen it 100 times over. But it's a waste of everyone's time. And so to really come knowing that you are walking onto sovereign land, walking into another domain that is not maybe what we're used to, not a government that functions in the way that we think it should function, or in a way that we've seen governments function before. But that's completely their choice and their own challenges that they're working through, and you have to go in with so much respect.
Yeah.
And it's that huge respect also for how to navigate the sovereign nation perspective with sometimes the federal government, which can be completely tricky, both Canada and the United States. And I think, Mark, I would also turn to you because you've been doing so much work on this, like how you've got to be that trusted entity and keep that relationship going. And it's trying to balance out that relationship. Yeah. I mean, I think, Dara, you've had a lot of experience recently going through some of the different communities. They might often think that if the federal folks get involved, things aren't going to go well, but there's often that gap you have to bridge, yeah?
Yeah, definitely. And I, through law school, I worked in the Department of Interior, which is really how I met Deb in the first place when we were out in Washington, D.C. together. And they essentially the Assistant Secretary of Indian Affairs was like, "You're the youngest person here, go figure out what they're talking about," and started sending me to broadband meetings because they hadn't it hadn't been one of their main issues. Federal recognition and getting land into trust and pipelines, like those were all kind of the things that were really important at the time to the administration as well as tribal leaders. And so this was kind of a new thing that, like Deb, you're kind of describing. It wasn't new, but it hadn't necessarily been on the top of the docket for decades. And now it really, really is, because it affects everything else on the docket. And so as far as the federal government getting involved, I'm so happy to see that their broadband, I forget what they're calling it, their consortium or whatever is happening, because that's something that we talked about when they were trying to, that summer that I was there in 2017, or 18 maybe, when they were trying to make this more of an issue. And so the federal government is, I would say, catching up as far as broadband and understanding some of these issues, but I would say for a long time, maybe they were sandbagging things more than they were accelerating things.
And Mark, could you help us with what would be your advice for the things that you don't do? Because if we're talking about maintaining relationship, what have you found to be the easiest way to just put yourself into a completely tricky situation because you didn't think about something that you needed to do with the community?
So I think, unfortunately, Mark had to drop to pick up his kids. But I would say, if I could channel Mark for a minute, I think anytime you stop listening and you stop actively listening throughout your process, you're doing the wrong thing. You put your foot in your mouth. You do something that is not going to be supported by the community. So, and I think Chris kind of made that point in the chat too about, are you willing to walk away if the community is not behind it? I think always your goal should be to identify the right partners off the bat, make sure the community's on board from step one. But if you find yourself in a position where you found the wrong partner, the community is not on board, then yeah, absolutely. Because you don't want to do more harm than good by forcing something on a community that's just not in their best interest.
Yeah, we had partners on a project where we were working with them for 5 years. And it was in a very strong tribally run island nation in the Pacific. And boy, somebody said, "Well, Jane, it's a different pace. Why are you waiting?" I said, "Because it's their country, it's their community, it's their sovereignty. It's not for me to say that they should go faster or slower. You just have to figure out how to keep the faith going." And that's part of the incremental building up of that relationship and keeping that flame alive and keeping it going.
I say that's probably the biggest mistake I ever have made, is wanting to move fast, wanting to solve the problem, wanting to jump in and get it done. And I have learned that I have to go slow to go fast. I have to stop and pause and listen. I have to let things happen organically, naturally, to the point where we can then move. Because if you try to go too fast and you bump into roadblocks, it is going to take you so much longer to repair that than it would have taken you to slow down and go at the pace that was natural for that project. That is the hardest part for me, because I like to get stuff done, So you got to let go of that, because it's really got to be about the community.
I couldn't agree with you more, Deb. And I think Sally's just sort of said something really helpful. Sally, could you say that on the chat? Because we are recording, and I think some people can only listen because they can't do all the video. Could you repeat what you've put in the chat there? Because it's super important.
Yes, hello. I wrote in the chat that it's very important to have strong ties to the communities you're working in, and to be respectful. Recognize that you are a guest in a sovereign territory, and you need to be all in, which is a poker term. This means working side by side with your local crew in all kinds of weather. Be prepared to work hard. The community's priorities have to be your priorities also, and help out with social, sports, etc. event situations. We had a situation a few years ago. I was supposed to be on a plane to Santa Fe in 2017. And we had a fiber break at the school in Attawapiskat. And I was a general manager. I could have gone to Santa Fe, but I didn't. I turned around, I went to Attawapiskat, and I worked with my crew for 4 days because an excavator had dug through a conduit, an underground conduit, and there was no phone service at the school, which meant that all the kids were at home and couldn't go to school. So I worked very, very hard for 3-4 days with my crew, getting them coffee, finding hair dryers so that we could thaw out the fiber, like just doing all sorts of stuff like that. And, supporting them, supporting the people in the community is so important. And understanding the social structure, who the families are, who the clans are, who the heads of the clans are. All that is very, very, very important. So best advice, just move respectfully and at the pace the community is prepared to move at.
And Sally, you've built quite a network where you are. What would you give us for advice on what not to do, other than what you've just said?
The biggest mistake that I have made is I failed to develop enough local capacity in the communities. I was still flying in people from down south to do critical infrastructure jobs, and for that reason, our project is delayed by about a year because we simply did not have the capacity in the communities, the expertise in the communities to carry out the project in times of COVID. So I couldn't get the gentleman that I had hired to go in and train the local people to do the splicing and read the design plans. He wasn't able to go in because he was from out of the community, and the communities were in lockdown. So whenever you can, try and find and build up that local capacity as soon as you possibly can, rather than having to fly people in. That was the mistake that I made.
That's a really powerful lesson. I think if we are working with a community to find a result, the goal would be that at some point you walk away and it maintains itself. And that doesn't happen unless you have built the strength of the people around you to take on the roles. So that's a really good story, Sally.
Yeah, that's that broad base of the pyramid. So it's absolutely, and somebody asked us, why would you be working so hard to turn something over that you built up? We have a thing, it's another type of internet infrastructure kind of training program we do with different communities. And this is in sub-Saharan Africa. And we said, well, it's not about us. It's about the community running the event so that in the future, it's community led. And so it's very curious to me that people often say, it is that weird, almost colonial mentality of, well, you can keep running something. I'm like, no, that's not why we built it. The whole point is that it's for the community, or with the community, not for, but in that sense of we want to make sure it's sustainable. I think that from a partnership perspective is part of the sustainability factor that you'll be talking about in other sessions, is that it's not just getting the right rules and regs in place, it's that human infrastructure. Again, that's almost more important in some ways, because that's your backbone, your human backbone of connectivity there. Anyone else? Because there are some others I can see in the chat here from other communities around the US and Canada. you may have something that you've observed or done that is either was a great best practice or something that you would share that you wouldn't do again. There's a question here too. Well, with Trevor, when you slow down, you also develop the local talent. Exactly, that's Sally's point too. And Deb, here's a question. How do you address the situation of having a big dream such as this, the fulfillment of the internet for all, when the community sees the beauty in the dream but think it's not realistic?
That's a tricky one. I think
Yeah.
that, it's sort of the messy space I find myself at the moment, right? Working on a collaborative of people to build out broadband to an additional 17,000 homes in the next 3 months, right? And managing all of the things that go with that. There are a lot of folks who think we will fail. And in fact, I would say there are folks who hope we will fail. They'll be happy to say, I told you so, and give us a hard time in the end. And I think that the goal is, as I said earlier in the chat, under promise, over deliver, and make some short-term wins to make sure people see the short-term success, right? So maybe they're going to be critical of the whole project, but if you can get that first leg of that project done and it has impact, they'll be happy about that. I think about RS Fiber in Minnesota, right? A whole bunch of communities got together, decided to figure out how to pool their money and build out broadband. And a couple of the communities said no thanks at the last minute. Guess who's really unhappy now? So thinking about how do we show those short-term wins before the decisions like that get made, to get those folks on board before they get too negative about the project being possible. And I always will think that showing other projects that have been successful and having folks talk from one community to another where they had similar issues and similar concerns, this one's been successful, see, we can do it too. I think that's also helpful.
I think also Maria's on the phone. I just noticed you, Maria. This is the Maria Alvarez I know from Mexico, is it?
Hi, Jane. It is.
Maria's spent a lot of time in Indigenous communities, and I know you're working in Canada now. Is this resonating with you, Maria, what we're saying?
Yeah, totally. I think this is very great to have this like time and space to share these things we all learn, like in different territories and at different community contexts. But it's always good to hear from our other experiences, and it will always be different in local process, because it's, I think, the amazing thing about community networks. They respond to very specific contexts, but it's great to have these opportunities to hear from others and learn what was being said previously about walking in with questions will allow all this process to happen differently. So thank you for sharing, and yeah.
And I think sometimes showing the change over time on a project may help with the question that was asked earlier about how does the community see the value? I know I've seen in some instances where we actually had a community almost say, why would you spend your time doing something like that when we need you out working? And it was as Deb was saying, the go slow to go fast, where the same people that asked that question all of a sudden said, well, wait a second, this is going to help my children, or it's going to help the community more. I see why it's helpful, and where it's educated, where they felt more educated about a thing that they could do. And sometimes it's just that very simple thing of the small task that you feel very proud of. There's a small village in Greece, and I know I'm using some international examples, but it's a global thing as well as local, where some of the older people in the village felt very isolated because their kids weren't around. They were hoping for more internet connectivity for their grandchildren to come visit. They literally have turned around the empowerment in this small place with some of the elders. I was staying with a grandma, they called it the Yaya in Greece. And we were using, believe it or not, my mobile for Google Translate to talk. I know a little Greek because I used to live there, but I was like, oh my gosh, she's way, I can't keep up with her. The grandmas and the grandfathers, the elders, are now crimping wire. They are putting in networks. They're hanging off roofs. I mean, I was amazed when I was there, but it changed the whole energy of the village, where all of a sudden, and I know in many tribal communities, there's such great respect for elders, but I hope that this is the type of thing with the community networks that you can continue that, and it can empower the elders to also feel that this thing that might be a bit foreign, the coming in, the technology is for the good and they can own it. And I think, Dara, you said it, from a sovereign perspective, it's their sovereign architecture that they're building, both with their community of interest people, but also that network, so that they're not having people tell them what to do and how to connect, but they can connect. I often like to say, from the village out. I hate this term last mile. I'm like, it's the first mile, it's the first mile out. So if we can help with that mind shift, the empowerment and the pride that you have in building that community of interest, but also building something together, is pretty crazy. And I think a lot of you saw that in Hawaii. We saw that in Inuvik. We saw that in Santa Fe, and it's just really fascinating to see how something can take off. And as Deb said, not to give up, you rebuild the community. That's another way to maintain it, is if you feel that there's something that there's a bit of a crisis, and you go back and you always have to refer to the community itself to give you some ideas on what to do to help change the situation. That's critical as well. I'll stop talking. Are there other questions? It's this timing thing again with the Indigenous, with certain communities where time is a different concept of, you've got hunting seasons, you've got tribal meetings that you have to have in order to move forward. And it's that different pace. I think it can be a killer on the community side if that's not something well understood. Again, it's having the trusted partner on the ground and amplifying them, I think there. Is there anything else anyone wants to share? Because some of you have done such amazing things. Peggy, I see you. I think you were with us in Santa Fe. Or you were actually in Inuvik with us. No mute. But Peggy was our Obi-Wan Kenobi when we went into Inuvik. I think I have that right, because she gave us the lay of the land. Mark already had known Peggy. But Peggy was one of our local champions who brought things together. I think one of my favorite things about Inuvik from the community building was Katie and I were sitting there. I don't know, Katie, was it was goose, moose. We had the soup, we were helping with the community feast. And some people were so surprised that we were all like helping out. But it showed them that we're there to work at their pace, to respect the community. And again, it was probably one of my favorite parts of the Inuvik meeting, was just working together and seeing and sharing some of the cultural moments, because if you don't put that respect back into the community, it's just never, that's a point of failure, quite frankly. Deb, anything else you can think of?
My favorite moment, one of my favorite moments from the movie, and I had a lot of them, was during that community dinner. And they called all the elders up to eat, and I was sitting and waiting my turn. And a couple of the elders came over and said, "Oh no, you get to join us." And I was so touched and honored that they would include me in that group. And it was just a really special time. It was a beautiful event and a beautiful opportunity to learn. So I entirely encourage folks to attend these programs because it makes such a difference.
And can I pull a couple of threads together? I think one of the things to think about in terms of the importance of building community is the problem definition of what we're doing specifically. I've spent a lot of time trying to learn about electrification, something that some people defined as 120 years ago building electric network. And right now we're in the midst of a massive conversation about how that electric network moves forward. So it's not like just building it solved the problem. This is something that is not a discrete event, like just building a network and then we're done. It will need to be managed. If it is a network that is solving a lot of problems and working well, you will probably have some outsider that will come in and offer to purchase it and make it easy on you to not have to do important things anymore. It's something we've certainly seen with the history of electrification and successful small ISPs. And it can be very tempting at that point to say, well, we got the internet, we got what we need, let's sell it and move on and do other things. And it's important to understand that then the next thing that comes up will be new technologies or governance issues. And this is something that is not a, build it and forget about it. It is something that will need to have processes that have local input well into the future. And so having that as your mindset, I think, is important. And the thing that I get when looking at community networks is often this sense of any good hike, which is miserable as you get over a peak just to see the bigger peak right behind it. And you're always sort of like in that state of both majestic awe, but you'll also be exhausted because like these are challenges that do keep going. And I think it's important to have that perspective rather than the sense of we just need a network and then we're done.
And Chris, that actually dovetails really nicely with the point that Sally was making about building the community standards on the ground, both I think the cultural standards of how you're going to operate, but then the technical standards, because you may have a different way of working or and the common understanding, making sure that that's sort of established. Sally, do you want to amplify that a bit? Because I think you're making a really good point about the technical architecture too.
I just want to follow up on what Chris said, and we're in a situation like that with Western James Bay where we have to balance whether or not we can survive. How much are we going to charge the end user? Do we need to cut our costs so that we can have money to set aside for future development? And there are back end possibilities that we can engage that make it a lot easier to handle some of the tasks rather than have WJBTN actually do it ourselves. So that's a consideration. Like, I agree, let's be as independent as we can, but also we have to consider from a business perspective, with the majority of our clients living below the poverty line, is it realistic for us to try and do everything ourselves when we could shop some of these tasks out? And the other thing that I'm not sure whether Chris touched on this or not, but I talked about it last week, is the whole idea of when you're building new networks, try and twin with a university or an entity that's doing research into energy consumption, and see if there's a way that you can actually reduce your the amount of energy that you have to use when you build your network.
That's hugely important, Sally. I think a lot of people forget. Well, it's critical on the energy side, but also your point about looking at partnerships that you may not have thought of, right? And how that works. And just to put a pitch out there for some of you that may be near universities that have the research and education networks, they're a huge pipe for backhaul if you can get them to help you. And that's a partnership you may not have, that may be out there, that it's one to explore. We've worked with a lot of communities where they hadn't thought of this, and now from truly it's from Ethiopia to Greece to wherever, to the United States to Canada, where I know Canary was a big partner when we were in Inuvik, that you can tap into them also to help train some of your local people, the experts that you're developing. You'll find that there are some amazing people in your communities that have skills that you just never knew. Anyone that's got the electrical experience, the plumbers, others who are builders of things, And people who have a good sense of architecture or systems that you may not have thought of. It's always I go for the bigger the net, the better of people to see. And I think, Deb, you mentioned earlier just this concept of introducing people to each other. Some people hoard these relationships, and it's others, it's like, let's just, the more people in the pot, the better, I think, Deb.
Yeah, I agree. It's really interesting because one of the things I love about the work that I get to do is supporting young folks that work with me into new opportunities, new roles, new educational opportunities, certifications. And people always say to me, aren't you afraid they'll leave? Well, yes, of course they do. We have a few examples today, but the whole point is that we're not in this for the short term, right? We're in this to help the future of this space. And if we're going to be really good soldiers in that effort, we ought to be training the next generation for leadership and get out of the way, right? So, I think that's a big part of this effort, to really focus on getting that next level of trained folks, right?
That's a great point.
In the chat, how do we channel complaining to doing? And maybe this is parenting advice, but complaining to doing, that's a pretty tough one because there'll always be the complainers. And there have been times when I've tried to just quiet the complainer, but that always comes back to bite me. It's better to address it, right? Better to say, here, I hear what you're saying. Come sit with me. Let's talk about what you think is going to happen, what you're angry about. Let's find a common solution. Let's move forward together. We can make this work, but we can't make it work without you, right? Trying to give them some of the responsibility for the success of the project. And there are always complainers.
Anna, I think there's some folks who have hands up. Can you help us there? Because I may have missed some people.
Yeah. Kyle, I see your hand is up. Was that your old hand or is this a new hand?
He actually wasn't able to.
Oh, I still can't hear you.
He put it in the chat, so it's an old hand.
Oh, it's the old one. Okay, great. I'll lower it. Maria, I see you have a hand up too. Do you want to unmute and?
Yes, thank you.
Yeah.
I just wanted to share very briefly that one thing I've learned from making mistakes and learning again in this process, it's to really step back from technology sometimes, like before or while starting a process, to find other questions in relation to the context, like what's going on in the community, what do we want for it, what do we dream of, and I think in this way, we can avoid thinking of connectivity as an end in itself, but as a possibility for local processes, for strengthening relationships to the land, to each other, or I don't know. I think stepping back from technology also allows us to find other reasons to use technology, such as, I don't know, language revitalization, empowerment, ownership on the content and knowledge that it's flowing through the networks, and to really look at the processes and the relationships that are woven along the way, because I think that's the really enriching part of this, such as like today getting together to discuss and to think. It's almost like an excuse to get together, and what Deb was saying, like about kind of affective networks, and I wanted to ask Deb, because I participate in Mexico and also in Canada, and I think it's a common challenge to rethink technology also from like a gender perspective, and for the empowerment of women participating in technology, in the technological field. And I wanted to ask Deb, and also thank you, Deb, for sharing all your experience. It's amazing and very exciting. and empowering to listen to you. And I wanted to ask you if, I don't know if there's anything to share about the participation of women in these processes. And yeah, thank you.
I love that perspective that we're not starting this process talking about the technology or the work or the money. We're talking about what are the challenges and how can those challenges be solved. And very often technology can be one of the solutions or maybe the best solution for some things. In terms of women's empowerment, I think there's a space for that. I don't think we've explored it enough. But when I think about what the women that we've supported, a lot of women who are homeless now have small businesses because they can work and sell their wares online. And, you know, women have been doing this work for a long time in our communities to make a little extra money. They've braided hair, they've cooked food, they've sewn, they've washed. You know, that's how people have supported their families. The internet allows you to take whatever that skill is and blow it up, right? So one example, when I was running the Tech Goes Home program in Boston, we had a woman go through our small business training, and she was making sock puppets. How many sock puppets can you sell to your neighbors, right? But she got online and she was selling them internationally, right? So the difference between having only that local group to sell to and that larger group to sell to can make a difference between whether or not a family eats this week, right? And so I think there is a great space, Maria, for us to really think about how women are far more empowered through this opportunity than they could be otherwise.
Are there any other questions that people have, or any other experiences you'd like to share? Best practices, worst practices? Not even, it doesn't even have to do with broadband specifically. Something that I think it was Trevor said in the chat was that electricity is a common parallel to broadband. So even just partnerships beyond broadband. Sally, I see you have a hand raised.
I just, I don't want to speak out of turn. I mean, if there's other people that want to say something, by all means, go ahead. But one of the areas that's important to consider when you're bringing connectivity to a community is there needs to be respect for the local technicians that are working on the connectivity. And what we have found in some of our communities is that these technicians don't get the level of respect that they deserve. And yeah, on many First Nations, the services are utilities such as, you know, getting your electrician to fix your home or having a plumber come in. These services are provided free. They're part of the responsibility of the band to its citizens. So what we found, I think, on the James Bay coast is people have this mindset that, you know, the technicians don't really deserve to be paid for the work that they do. And that is one area that's of concern that we have to work on is, you know, when someone comes to your home and fixes something for you, you say thank you and you pay them. The other area is the whole issue around when you bring connectivity into a community, is there any sort of a responsibility towards helping the community to develop, say, a community internet association to monitor what the community standard is going to be in that community? Like we have agreements with, most end users have agreements with their internet provider that they will not use the internet for purposes that are illegal. But in many cases in the community, it comes down to situations where there are people that are using the internet for nefarious purposes. Pornography or child pornography, trafficking, all these things. So it's important that somehow the communities be given the tools to deal with situations like this. And I think what I would like to do in our communities on the James Bay coast is start community associations that would help determine what the community standard is going to be. What is the community going to tolerate in terms of how the internet is going to be used? And of course, you walk a fine line there, because you don't want to censor because we have free speech. But on the other hand, if the communities are sovereign nations, they have a responsibility to their citizens or to their members to make sure that no one is hurt, if they can be, if there's a way to prevent it.
Yeah, thank you, Sally. Are there any other comments or experiences or questions?
Don't give up. That's one thing I would say. It can be hard on occasion, and you wonder if you're just in the sense that people will come to you from a community and say, we tried this and we tried this and we tried this. And sometimes it is just maybe a sit down and a reboot, and looking at it from a systemic perspective of your partners, and if there's something you can just tweak to reboot that partnership. I'm a firm believer and optimist in what we're doing. And I should say that I worked on big aid projects in other places, and sometimes you might as well have flown across the country and thrown the money out the window of the airplane for it to have been useful. And I truly believe in these community-based projects. I've seen such success, and I'm just so, it's always inspiring too, because you learn something every single time you're working with other people, something that can be transferable to another place. So I think it's really important not to lose sight of the fact that everybody has something to contribute, and it's the keeping your ears open, as Deb said, and listening. And Sally, I think everybody said that, right? It's just really, and opening up your mind. There's so much potential in each community that I think sometimes we look past, like you said, Sally, you look past the local technicians who are the people climbing up trees, the climbing up poles. I've seen them around the planet, you know, just digging in because they're the doers, but then you've got the other planners. You know, it depends on what you have in your community. But don't, you know, keep your eyes open and your ears open, I think. In that respect, I think, Dara, you said this too, everybody said that. It's the respect factor. If you don't have that, I think your whole, your partnerships are on it's a tricky thing. Anyway, Deb, any last thoughts before we close?
The last thing I'll say is that if there's one thing I've learned, it's that if you walk in thinking you have all the answers, you're not going to solve the problem. If you walk in assuming you know some things and you have a lot to learn, you'll be far more successful.
If it's okay, I'd like to say something. I would like to thank the presenters. I think this has been my most favorite one yet of all of the series we've come to. Maybe it's because I come from a background of a lot of community related organizations, but you know, everybody's hitting spot on, and a lot of people tend to forget that each community you go into operates differently, and they have a different hierarchy in how they operate. So I appreciate you guys really hammering that out to the middle of left field, because as Jane said, you know, the experts come in and say, this is how you got to do it. And you just sit there and you wait for them to stumble so you can come in, clean up, and move forward. But you know, I think it's important that if you come in, you do it right, and you move forward, and you have a better success. When you have community buy-in, you have a successful project. If you're doing it without the community buy-in, that's when you're going to trip up. So thank you so much for everything that you guys presented today. I really, really appreciate it.
Thank you.
Thank you for that. All right, so if there's no more questions or comments, I have one more thing of housekeeping that I'd like to do before we wrap up. And that is to propose that we do a Slack channel or a listserv for participants. This is something that we did last year. It was an email listserv and it wasn't used very much, and so we didn't bring it back this year yet, but there's a lot of really awesome conversations going on in the chat and a lot of really great points being made in discussion. And we're happy to create some kind of forum for you all to connect. So I'm going to go and create a poll really quickly and see if we can decide if we want Slack or an email listserv. So we'll do this really quickly. Thanks for your patience. Just bear with me for another second. All right, do you all see that on your, oh. All right, great. So the poll is live right now. I'm going to let it run for a minute or so. And oh, it didn't last very long. Hold on. Okay, it looks like Slack is winning. I'll leave it open for 10 more seconds until 40 seconds. All right. Great, so thank you all for voting. Keeping that in mind, I will work some Slack magic and invite you all to a Slack channel where we can talk more about this. So great, thank you all for joining today. Thank you to Deb and Jane. We really appreciate your insights and your expertise, and thank you to everyone who participated and sent in questions and shared your experiences. I think part of what makes these trainings and the ICS so valuable is that we're able to all learn from each other. So really appreciate it. And I'm going to post this recording and the chat also, so you all can refer back to things people said in the chat later. All right, well, thank you so much, everyone.
Thank you.